The Industrial Revolution is an interesting time period. It comes out of the Enlightenment, and it comes out of Enlightenment ideas. The whole concept behind the Industrial Revolution was basically improving mankind's life through science and technology. And, of course, the Enlightenment was involved very deeply with natural law, with individual freedoms, but still it focused on logic and what man could accomplish, not superstition, not tradition, but based on logic and ultimately what became science. Now, the Industrial Revolution basically is the beginning of our age of technology. It's a time period where people begin to understand that by using technology, we can improve all sorts of things. We can improve communication. This is the invention of the telegraph that allowed people to communicate over long distances. It's the invention of steamships and steam trains that allow people to travel further than was possible ever before. It's the invention of farming equipment and factories that allow food and goods to be produced at a greater rate. The Industrial Revolution paves the way for our time period, for a place where you can go to a furniture store, to Walmart, buy things for your home that have been mass-produced at a cheap price and bring them home. Now, of course, there's some awesome side effects to that. Dude, you can buy stuff. You can afford stuff. Even if you don't have an amazing job and you're not incredibly rich, you can still buy stuff. What a concept. On the other hand, the mechanisms put in place to make that stuff were not controlled. In other words, this is the beginning of factories and mass production. And people basically, as they figure out how to make stuff in a factory setting, how to mass produce stuff, they start making stuff and mass producing stuff. Nobody asks questions about, well, is this safe? Is this the right way to do this? How are you taking care of your workers? No one ever considers any of those things. They simply consider, oh, wow, you can make lots of those really quick if you do it this way. The Industrial Revolution has an upside and a downside to it. The upside is innovation. There is incredible progress and a rise in efficiency. More stuff can be made far more quickly. More goods can be produced more efficiently, and there's a path to a better tomorrow. That equality that they talked about in the Enlightenment, it's on its way to being here. More people can afford more stuff. You have to remember, everything was made by hand. Shoes were made by hand. A pair of shoes could cost a modern equivalent of hundreds of dollars until the advent of factories. And then when shoes were made in factories, gee, you could buy them for the modern equivalent of 20 bucks. Now, was the quality just as good? No, but well, you could buy a pair. It's better to have a cheap pair than no pair at all, isn't it? The bad side, the downside, was that because there was such a demand for goods and factories became so popular, they had thousands of people waiting to work in factories. We'll talk about why in just a minute. And there was no need to worry about pay, benefits, workers' rights, or protection. They simply packed the people who were waiting for a job into the factory and worked them. If they got injured, if something bad happened, oh well, tough luck. You're out of here. Hire a new guy. There was no such thing as workman's compensation. Taking care of someone who was injured on the job. No, they simply fired that guy and got a new guy. There was also a huge problem with child labor, partially because on the farm, where a lot of these people came from, kids were expected to start working on the farm, helping their parents out around age 6 or 7. That's when they started doing little stuff in the fields with the animals and so on. So when people came to the city and began working in factories, heck, the kids started work in the factory about the same time they would have started work at home on the farm, around the age of 6 or 7. Now, they took it easy on kids. Most adults in a factory in the Industrial Revolution would be working 12 to 16-hour days. Kids only worked 8 to 10-hour days. They had it really, really easy. So child labor, they're only working like 10-hour days, 6 days a week. That's nothing for a 7-year-old. Overall, there is a trade-off here. Stuff is produced efficiently. The bad part is that people get treated like parts of a machine. People are worked until they're exhausted. There's no concern for their health, their well-being, their mental health. Are you kidding? Children are worked from a very early age, and basically those people are not treated like people. They're treated like things. They're treated like objects, cranking out labor like the parts of the machines that they work on. These factories became more and more common in Europe, and particularly in England and America. The factories were efficient. In fact, for the first time, people actually began to measure productivity scientifically. There is, for the first time, a science that actually measures how long it should take to do a particular task in a factory. So, for example, if your job in the factory is screwing the cap onto a shampoo bottle, all right, someone would come in and measure with a stopwatch how many seconds does it take to screw on that cap. Then they would figure out, using math of course, if your job is to screw caps on shampoo bottles every 1.5 seconds for 6 hours straight. Judging by the number of seconds it took in the stopwatch test to screw on the cap of that shampoo bottle and a 1.5 second interval between shampoo bottles, how many shampoo bottles should you have produced by the end of your 6-hour shift? Your ranking and whether or not you stayed employed was based on that number computed in best circumstances. That makes things pretty darn brutal. I mean, if you are actually timed and expected to meet a certain mathematically computed number, that's pretty darn brutal, and that was what was expected. Your shift, which could range between 10 and 14 hours, you were expected to be at maximum productivity for that length of time. If you did not meet that productivity, you were fired and someone else was hired. There were no nice, 15-minute breaks. There were no, forget it. You were not treated like a human being. In some cases, bathroom breaks were even limited. You were treated as yet another piece of the machine, and if you were not producing, just like the wheels and cogs around you, you were gotten rid of just like a broken machine would be replaced or repaired. Now, these factories are common in America, but perhaps the most common location for them is England. Why are these so common in England, and how on earth did these factories get started anyway? Well, the answer to that really comes in the time period between 1800 and 1850, when something really remarkable happens. A number of factors, including some good weather, some birth rates, higher birth rates, medical improvements such as preventing infant mortality and allowing people to live longer with good nutrition, all kick in within that 50-year period. And in that 50 years, the population of Europe absolutely explodes. In the area that you're seeing, that's that peach color, particularly Great Britain, Northern Prussia, and little areas in Southern Prussia, the population increases over 80%. That is unbelievable. The population doesn't double, it doesn't triple. It goes up 80% in 50 years. That is an unbelievable increase in the number of people that you need to clothe, house, and feed. To add to that, farming is gradually becoming more and more efficient. So it takes fewer people to get the same amount of food out of a farm. So fewer people to get the same amount of food, more people available. You have more people than you need to work the pre-existing jobs. So what do those extra people do? What do those additional people need? Well, those additional people go looking for work, and those extra people frequently end up in the cities. Those cities are increasingly keyed to industry, to factories, to mass production. With that change in farming technique, about a large percentage of your population head off to the cities, and the cities grow unbelievably in a very quick amount of time. London, for example, grows by 40 to 60%. Now, that means that the infrastructure in those cities is not necessarily able to grow at the same speed to support the people who are flooding into the city. If you're not clear what infrastructure means, that means roads, sanitation, restaurants, food concessions, living, apartments, housing, and so on. Basically, the infrastructure, the amount of food available, the amount of apartments and living accommodations available in London does not grow by 40 to 60%, but the population does. So you've got 40% more people in your city, but you do not have 40% more apartments so that they can have somewhere to live. What on earth happens? Well, people end up living on the streets. People end up finding whatever they can, wherever they can. For example, in London, it's very, very common to have a storefront where out in front it says, spend the night 1 penny. When you go in, all it is a long, narrow place where a store would be, and on both sides against the walls are long wooden benches, usually stolen from a church. Along those wooden benches in front of them is a piece of rope strung up from hooks on both ends of the benches, about a chest height along the bench. People could spend 1 cent to sleep there, being held on the bench while they slept by a piece of rope. It was better and safer than sleeping in the street, even though it wasn't the most comfortable location. There's something else you've got to keep in mind here during the Industrial Revolution. This is not like today. This is the 1800s. During this time period, there is no such thing as a national census. There is no such thing as a driver's license or a social security card. Who you are, your family knows, your friends know, but there is no official government record of you. There are millions of people in England, hundreds of thousands of people in London, and there is no documented record of these people other than maybe their name on a factory payroll. No one can track down who someone is. Today you can pull their cell phone records, their credit records, their housing records, their tax records. That does not exist in London. You have thousands, hundreds of thousands of poor people living on the streets in London, and who keeps track of them? Nobody. Who is responsible for the condition of these children sleeping on the streets, starving? No one. There's a question of state responsibility. Shouldn't the government be helping out these poor people? Well, maybe, but how's the government going to do that? Well, in order to do that, the government has to charge higher taxes. There are poor taxes that create poor houses, but those poor houses are often horrible. They're one step above slavery. Frequently, the poor houses involve child labor. They're horrible, ugly places, and yet that's what the state provides. There's this great quote in Charles Dickens in Christmas Carol, where the two wealthy men come into Scrooge's business, and they ask Ebenezer Scrooge for a handout to help the poor. And Scrooge says, I pay taxes. What are you asking me for money for? Are the poor houses closed? Are there no poor houses? Let them go to the poorhouses and work for their keep. He's talking about this time period, a time period where undocumented people swarm the streets of London, scratching out a living, dying on the streets, and no one knows who lives and who dies. No one keeps track of them. The turning point to this, where the people really begin paying attention to these poor people, these factory workers, these homeless people, these child laborers, really comes when they can no longer be ignored. The tipping point comes when there starts a spectacular, lurid string of murders on the streets of London. No one knows who is responsible until the newspapers get a hold of a note given to the London Police Department and signed, yours truly, Jack. This Jack the Ripper is responsible for a string of 5 murders in the Whitechapel district of London, one of the nastier districts frequented by sailors and home to a number of prostitutes. The murders committed by Jack the Ripper are lurid, splashy. To this day, they fascinate us because they are so gruesome, so grotesque. Details like the fact that the women's throats are slit with a single powerful blow. In the case of the last victim, Mary Kelly, she's almost decapitated by a single blow from a weapon. Not an easy thing to do. The fact that many of these women are missing internal organs and that they are eviscerated with surgical precision. It fascinates us, but what it does is it catapults the crime on the streets of London into the newspapers. And when people hear about these Ripper killings, and they realize that these are not the first set of killings that this has happened. I mean, we know of 5 Ripper killings. There may have been more. And there are many other killings like the Ripper killings. Many spectacular killings across London. No one's ever heard of them. Why not? Because the people who are killed are nobodies. They're hookers, child laborers, child prostitutes, people who live below the radar. They are not politically correct. They're not a part of the world of the wealthy. They're a part of that underside, that dark factory culture. No one keeps track of them. No one knows about them. And all of a sudden, they're brought into the spotlight by the killings of Jack the Ripper. And all of a sudden, with these horrible newspaper stories, putting out banner headlines of these murders and saying, nobody knew about this. Nobody pays attention. Who cares for these poor and homeless? All of a sudden, the upper classes of society are faced with the problem in bold newsprint, and something has to be done. The question is, of course, what? With the Ripper killings, there is no question about the existence of the problem. Who is supposed to take care of it? Well, in earlier times, there would have been a religious motivation. This would have been the responsibility of everyone out of a moral obligation. Jesus told people to take care of the poor and the indigent. It was a part of their Christian duty, their moral duty, their responsibility to their religious beliefs and to society as a whole, because religious belief taught that social responsibility was an important part of being a Christian. But that's no longer a central point. We got rid of that responsibility with Henry VIII and the Act of Supremacy. Monasteries no longer exist to take care of the poor. Instead, it's the job of the state, and the state relies on taxes, and people don't like paying taxes. So, in the honor of the Enlightenment, people begin looking for a social solution. They begin looking to science. What is the greater good? How do we take care of these social problems? How did we end up with so many of these poor people living on the streets, being hookers, child prostitutes, and borderline laborers and drunks anyway? How did we get them, and how do we solve this problem? There has to be a reason for why there are so many of these poor, quote-unquote, disreputable folks. There's got to be a reason for it. Why are these killings happening? Why are our streets cluttered with these poor and these inadequate souls? There are a number of explanations proposed. One of the earliest and most famous is actually proposed by a gentleman named Thomas Malthus. The Malthusian theory is based on a very scientific point of view. Basically, Malthus says that if you look at nature, or in the Enlightenment, natural law, if you look in nature, animal populations are controlled by overcrowding. There is a limited number of resources. We're going to get to Darwin in a little while. There's a limited number of resources available. Animals continue to breed. They continue to have baby animals until there's not enough resources to continue to support those baby animals. When that happens, the excess animal population, usually the young and the old and weak, either die off from starvation or are killed off by the stronger in order to allow their offspring to survive. Thomas Malthus applies that theory, that observation in nature, to what is happening in London and other cities around the world during the Industrial Revolution. Basically, Malthus says, when left unchecked, the poor, the ones closest to the animal world, will simply breed unchecked and prey upon the provided resources. There comes a point where the population meets the amount of resources. When those two forces meet, you have more population than there are available resources. Nature will correct itself through crime, through murder, through starvation. And basically, people will die until the number of people being born matches the available resources, and then you'll meet that common middle point. Malthus basically writes that during the Industrial Revolution, human population is under adjustment. All those people who are dying and being murdered in London and other major cities are simply a correction We have too many people and not enough resources at this point. Therefore, according to the laws of nature, there is a correction being made, and many of these poor, indigent, overpopulation are being corrected. They're dying in order to make sure that we reach the point of crisis, the point where the number of people in the population matches up with the available resources. It's a very scientific theory, but ultimately what Malthus says is that you have two choices. Either let correction go on naturally and let the murders and the competition for resources continue and eventually things will balance out, or prevent people from having kids. When you do one of those two things, ultimately you're going to end up with the same result. You're going to end up with a sustainable level of population and resources. For many modern people, though, that's a rather horrific way of looking at human population. These are people, you know, and we're talking about just letting them murder each other and compete for resources as a normal event. Well, looking at it scientifically, if you remove morality from the equation and look at it in terms of logic and science, there's merit to Malthus' theory, and we'll get back to that in a little while. Now, these people who are being eliminated, the surplus population, in order to create a balance of resources, are, however, quite human. And a lot of them are angry and resentful about their treatment, that they are being treated like cogs in a machine, that they are not being given any honor or respect, and they rise up. In fact, there are several groups that actually actively try to destroy technology, to eliminate factories. And one of the best known of those groups is a group who call themselves the Luddites. Now, Luddites are anti-technology. They hate factories and technology, and they actually get together and actively destroy that technology. They want to go back to a simpler world, a world where technology has not, in their world, taken away the individual's rights, denied us our personhood, taken away our identity and our sense of artistry, creativity, and the value of quality. Luddites strike out against technology and against factory owners, frequently burning down factories or taking sledgehammers to factory equipment in order to protest their treatment and to try to reclaim what they feel is some sense of personhood and dignity in the face of a faceless machine that simply makes them individual cogs and makes them less than human.